Good evening. So, this is my first TED event. And I'm really impressed by all the performances we've seen and how much we've learned. So that's certainly due to the good speakers, but I think it's also thanks to you. You're really open-minded and supportive audience. So that's why I dared to ask you for your support also for my TED Talk. Could you please think of the following 3 questions? First one, who of you considers yourself as a rebel? Now, you've been sitting for all afternoon, right? Could I ask the rebels amongst us to get up, please? Wow. Wow. Thank you. Could you please keep standing, and I'm now asking those still sitting. Who of you has ever been in a situation where you wanted to change the rules? Maybe, stand up. Maybe those still sitting think of the time when you were a teenager. Oh. Perfect. That's quite a lot of us standing. Now, question to all of you standing. Have you ever been unsuccessful in changing the rules you disapproved of? If you've ever been in a situation where you have been unsuccessful in changing the rules you wanted to change, could you please sit down? Now, I'm sitting because in my life, very often I have not changed the rules, not changed the systems that I disapproved of. When I was in a situation where I had to decide whether to love it, change it, or leave it, I've almost always left. I've lived on my own at the age of 17 because I didn't want to obey to the rules of a household with 6 children. I've left 3 jobs. I've left my home country, Austria. And I've even changed profession because all the systems I was in didn't seem to permit the combination of a meaningful, intellectually stimulating job with bringing up children the way I wanted to do that. But now I'm married. I have 2 children, 2 jobs, a house and a credit. So leaving is not a viable option anymore. And that's why I've looked into the 2 alternatives. Love it, change it. And when I heard about the theme of this TED event, rebellion, I thought that's perfect. Because isn't rebellion the most radical form of change? And so, through the last few weeks, I've looked into the lives of rebels from different continents, from different centuries, from very different fields, all the way from politics to modern arts. And I've discovered 3 key elements that make the difference between those who succeed and those who fail. And I'm strongly convinced that if we respect those 3 key elements of successful rebellion, we can increase the probability of being successful in changing the rules we want to change. Now, in order to understand those 3 key elements of successful rebellion, I would like to share with you the story of a rebel that you're probably all familiar with, Che Guevara. Now, why Che Guevara? Well, first of all, because you're all familiar with him. But secondly, the fact that he's been so successful in Cuba, but he's failed in Bolivia, is extremely insightful for understanding what's the difference between success and failure. Now, Che Guevara was born in 1928 in Argentina, the first of 5 children of a family of European descent with definitely leftist leanings. He studies medicine, and during his studies, he travels extensively through Latin America. Now, that's when he sees the realities of the lower social classes in his home continent. When in Chile, he's shocked by the miserable working condition of the mine workers. Accidents and casualties almost every day. He sees them working with their bare hands because they don't have any tools. He travels on to the Atacama Desert, and there he's deeply moved by the encounter with a persecuted communist couple. They don't even own a blanket to protect themselves from the biting cold of the desert. And Che Guevara writes in his diary that he's met the shivering blood and flesh victims of capitalist exploitation. He travels on to Bolivia and to Peru, and there he's struck by the poverty of the indigenous peasant population. They're laboring very small plots of lands owned by extremely wealthy and mostly white landlords. Now, these experiences have led to the conviction that most likely he would have to leave his field of medicine and move to the political arena in order to help these people. But nevertheless, he finishes his study and he becomes Dr. Ernesto Guevara in 1953. He continues traveling in 1953 in Latin America, going all the way to Central America, and he settles down in Guatemala. Why Guatemala? Because there, for the first time in history, a democratically elected president is about to implement land reforms, distributing land to those poor peasants. He introduces universal suffrage. But only after a year, this elected president is overthrown by a military junta, and that regime reverses all the reforms. Che Guevara is already very close to the intellectual part of the Communist Party in Guatemala, and he has to flee. He flees to Mexico. And in Mexico, he meets this man, Fidel Castro, the leader of the Cuban revolutionary 26th of July movement, which Che Guevara joins after the first meeting with Fidel Castro, after a light-long discussion, because they've got the same vision. They've got this vision of the classless society, and they're both convinced that the only way to get there is armed struggle. Now, Fidel Castro knows Cuba extremely well. He's learned it the hard way through a failed attack intended to overthrow the dictator Batista in 1953. And that's when they get together and they start gathering the support of the 26th of July movement in Cuba. They gather the support in the urban cities, and they gather the support of the peasants living in the southeastern part of Cuba. And that's exactly where Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and about 20 men set up the base camp when they land in Cuba in 1956. Now, the disastrous economic situation in Cuba at that point of time, the high unemployment on the one hand side, and the dictator Batista living in clover due to his close link to the American companies that exploit the Cuban economy on the other hand, make it relatively easy for Che Guevara and Castro to recruit committed fighters. Because as Che Guevara writes, those men who know why they're fighting will triumph. And this is what happens. They win against the Batista troops in the Sierra Maestra. And as Fidel Castro says, who takes Sierra Maestra takes Cuba. So in January 1959, Che Guevara takes Santa Clara. And the day after, Batista flees to the Dominican Republic. They take Havana and thus Cuba. Now, 7 years later, Che Guevara, with a dozen of Cuban volunteers, infiltrate Bolivia because they want to replicate the Cuban Revolution there. They set up a base camp in the mountainous region of the southeastern parts of Bolivia. They recruit men and fighters, mainly from the margins of the Bolivian population. They established a support network in La Paz. They also tried to get the support from the peasant population. And at the beginning, they win very important battles against the Bolivian army. But then the tide turns. And in 1967, Che Guevara is captured, executed, and the Bolivian revolution defeated. Now, why has Che Guevara been so successful in Cuba? Why has he failed in Bolivia? Hasn't he taken the same approach? And this is where the three key elements of successful rebellion provide an answer. Number one, a clear and shared vision. Now, that's certainly the strength of Che Guevara and his guerrilla movement. They had this clear vision of the classless society, and that was shared among all the people. And that was the case in Cuba, as it was in Bolivia. Number two, a good understanding of the system you're fighting against. Now, certainly Fidel Castro knew the system. He has been from Cuba. He has already fought the system and failed. In Bolivia, Che Guevara was not aware of what has happened after 1952 when he had last visited the country. The Bolivian National Revolution actually had led to an agrarian reform, distributing land to those indigenous peasants that he had met. And they had already implemented universal suffrage in Bolivia. And all these changes have not been reversed by the military dictator who had taken over Bolivia in a coup d'etat in 1964. And that leads us right away to the third element, support from the key stakeholders. Now in Cuba, Che Guevara had the support from the peasants, from the workers, and from the intellectual communists. In Bolivia, however, the peasants were supporting the dictator. He was very popular. He was almost one of them because he spoke Quechua, the language of the indigenous population. He's grown up in Cochabamba, which is at the center of Bolivia, a rural area. And he, at the very beginning of his ruling, had implemented a military peasant pact where the peasant militia had agreed to subordinate themselves to the Bolivian army. Neither did Che Guevara have the support of the Communist Party in Bolivia because they couldn't agree on the priority of military struggle over the political struggle. So the only part of the population that supported Che Guevara and his movement in Bolivia were the workers. But they were a minority in a country where the peasants made up for 65% of the population. So now you might ask yourself whether those three key elements of success that we have deduced from this very extreme situation of armed struggle could also be applicable to the situations you and I are in when we want to change the rules. Now, I would invite you to think back to the situation where you've been unsuccessful in changing the rules, the situation you thought about at the beginning of the talk. Have you had a clear vision of what the situation would look like if you succeeded in changing the rules? Did you share that vision with the people around you? Did you have a good understanding of the system, of the rules you were fighting against? And last but not least, were you aware of all the key stakeholders, their positions, their roles, how their positions would change if you were successful in implementing the changes you were looking for? Have you been successful in winning their support? Now that you know the three key elements of successful rebellion, a clear and shared vision, a good understanding of the environment, and support from the key stakeholders, will you in the future try more often to change instead of leaving? Will you be a rebel? Thank you.